World efforts to gear environment changing are way off path, says the UN, as it detailed information the at first growth in CO2 emissions in 4 persons year. To encounter the goals of the Paris Environment Agreement, the research says it's key how world emissions spike by 2020. But the analyze says how the is now not potential though by 2030. It key points the distinction among the standard of hothouse gas emissions how the planet can suffer to hold temperature during secure framework, in the levels how our potential relying on the promises and actions undertaken by countries. The year's paper accounting records the greatest gap yet among wherever we are and wherever we requirement to be. Among 2014 and 2016, world emissions of CO2 of production and the manufacture of power were substantially steady time the world economics grew humbly, but in 2017 these emissions went up by 1.2% spurred on by high gross domestic product. On to the UN, to hold the planet under how goal, world hothouse gas emissions in 2030 would include to be 55% reduce rather than present. Down there is yet a terrible gap among speech and affair, among the targets coordinated by governments world to stabilize our environment and the measures to reach these goals, told Dr. Gunnar Luderer, of the Potsdam Institution for Environment Effect Study and one of the authors of the research. The scientists say how to gear the space, nations must lift their vanity 5 stack to encounter the purpose. Order currently, the planet is header for a heat growth of by the end of the age the paper says. One key dimension of the research is on the peak of world hothouse emissions. The paper says how peak of emissions in 2020 is key for reaching the heat targets in the Paris Treaty, but the scope of the present efforts is inadequate. The research says how by 2030, about 57 countries presenting on 60% of world emissions will include pointed anywhere close wherever the planet is necessary to be. In several ways affirmative. The research says how countries consisting Argentina, Australia, Canada, the EU, consisting the UK, Southward Korea, Saudi Arabia, Southward Africa and the US, are declining brief of reaching their popularly established contributions for 2030. 3 countries, Brazil, China and Japan are now on path, time 3 other, India, Russia and Turkey are set to hit their targets. The authors trust how several of these artistic achievements may be downward to installation comparatively low targets for their domestic plans. Certainly, affirmative. The UN is placement large hopes in which it regulation non-state actors, importance regional, town and provincial governments, business community and high formation institutions can include main impacts on the next space. They estimation how, order currently, more than rather than 7,000 cities of 133 countries and 6,000 companies in at low $36 billion in income include incorporated to get environment activity. But the authors trust the is fair clawing the shallow. In above 500,000 openly sold companies world, down there are lot more than how can get stairs how accumulatively would include a considerable effect on the space. The research says how down there is the capacity to cut emissions of the segment by 19 gigatons of CO2 counterpart per year by 2030, how's quite to hold the planet on a to extent way. The paper as well suggests how by the government tax plans could be extremely essential in dealing emissions. It says how carbon sequestration taxes or carbon sequestration trade system lid just 15% of the world carbon sequestration exit, that could growth to 20% if China inventory its plan marketplace. But the paper says how part of the emissions of fossil embers are not taxable at all and just 10% are estimated at a standard consecutive in compliance heating to 2C. While governments hug financial politics measures to subsidize cheap emission alternatives and tax fossil embers, they can encourage the order investment in the power segment and considerably bring carbon sequestration emissions, told Jian Liu, UN Environmental's head scholar. If all fossil gas subsidies were gradual of, world carbon sequestration emissions could be diminished by up to 10% by 2030. Installation, the order carbon sequestration cost is as well significant. At $70 per ton of Company 2, radiation reductions of up to 40% are probable in several countries. The paper is designed at informative convention delegates to following 1 week's key environment meeting in Katowice, Poland. Negotiators will be hard to complete the rules on how to carry out the guideline volume of the Paris Treaty, but the paper's authors expect it can shove countries to more levels of vanity. Germany and Europe could show management in the region by pledge full hothouse gas neutral by 2050 and a precise enhancing of the radiation reducing targets for 2030, told Dr. Gunnar Lüderer.